candle flickered between us, its flame casting shadows that danced across Catherine's face like ghosts I didn't yet recognize. Our hands were clasped over it, the heat just shy of unbearable, but I held on. 20 years. That's what this moment was supposed to celebrate. 2 decades of love, of building a life, of raising a son. But as I looked into her eyes, something felt off. Her smile was too wide, her grip too loose, like she was here but not really here. The pastor was saying something about commitment, about weathering storms, but my focus was narrowing to the way her lips twitched, the way her gaze kept darting to the side. She was looking at her best friend, Sarah, who stood off to the left, clutching a bouquet of roses that smelled faintly of rot, though no one else seemed to notice. And then it happened. Catherine leaned in, just slightly, her voice a low murmur that carried just far enough to reach me. "He still has no clue," she whispered to Sarah. The words hit me like a sucker punch. My grip on her hand tightened involuntarily, and for a moment, I thought the candle might tip over, setting the whole damn place on fire. But it didn't. The flame steadied, and so did I, at least outwardly. Inside, though? Inside, I was unraveling. The ceremony dragged on, but I barely heard any of it. My wedding ring felt like a lead weight, pressing into my finger, a constant reminder of the vows I'd taken, the promises I'd made, and the ones she'd clearly broken. I kept replaying that whisper in my head, dissecting it, trying to make sense of it. No clue about what? The question gnawed at me, but I couldn't ask. Not here, not now. When it was finally over, Catherine turned to me with that same too-wide smile, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. She reached up to adjust my tie, her fingers brushing against my chest in a way that felt more like a performance than a gesture of affection. "You looked so handsome up there," she said, her voice light, airy, like nothing was wrong. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her, demand to know what she meant, what she was hiding. But instead, I forced a smile, nodded, and let her lead me toward the reception hall. The scent of those roses followed us, cloying and sickly sweet, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The unease grew with every step, every laugh, every toast. Catherine moved through the crowd like a queen, her laughter ringing out, her hands brushing against arms, shoulders, glasses of champagne. And me? I was just there, a prop in her perfect little show. But that whisper, it wouldn't let me go. He still has no clue. By the time we got home, the candle from the ceremony was sitting on our kitchen counter, its wax pooling at the base, the flame long extinguished. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the weight of that whisper pressing down on me, heavier than any vow I'd ever taken. And I knew, deep in my gut, that something was very, very wrong. It was the morning after the vow renewal, and the house felt heavy, like the air was made of wet concrete. I was in the garage, staring at an old toolbox I hadn't opened in years, when Alex came in. He was supposed to be at work, but there he was, his face pale, his hands shaking like he'd just seen a ghost. He didn't say much at first, just grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the kitchen. His grip was tight, almost desperate, and I could feel his pulse through his fingers. "Dad," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You need to see this." He pulled out his phone, and I noticed how his thumb hesitated over the screen, like he wasn't sure he wanted to show me. The kitchen light was harsh, bouncing off the polished countertops, and it made the shadows under his eyes look deeper. I remember thinking, this isn't about work. This isn't about money. This is worse. He swiped through a few photos, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped the phone. The first one was blurry, taken from a distance, but I recognized her instantly. Catherine. She was standing close to someone. Too close. Her business partner, Mark. They were outside some restaurant, her hand on his arm, leaning in like she was sharing a secret. My stomach dropped, but I told myself it was nothing. Just a friendly gesture. Just business. Then came the next photo. Clearer this time. They were in a parking garage, and Mark had his hand on her waist. Her head was tilted back, laughing at something he said. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in years. The kind of laugh that used to be mine. My chest tightened, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Alex didn't say anything, just kept swiping. The next photo was the one that broke me. It was taken through a window, the glass slightly fogged, But there was no mistaking what I was seeing. Catherine, in a dimly lit room, her arms around him, their faces pressed together. The intimacy of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that screen. The world around me seemed to slow down, the hum of the refrigerator fading into the background. I could hear Alex saying something, his voice tight with worry, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could see was that photo. The way she looked at him, the way she touched him. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something she'd been hiding from me for who knows how long. Alex finally took the phone back, his hands still shaking. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how to tell you, but you needed to know." I nodded, but I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. I reached for the counter to steady myself, my wedding ring catching the light. It felt heavier somehow, like a chain I hadn't realized I was wearing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, break something, but I just stood there, numb. The images kept replaying in my mind, each one sharper than the last. The way she'd whispered to her friend at the ceremony. The way she'd been so distant lately. All the little signs I'd ignored, brushed off as stress or work or whatever excuse I told myself. I felt stupid, blind. Alex stayed with me, his presence a silent anchor, but I could tell he was scared. Scared of what I might do. Scared of what this meant for all of us. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that we'd figure it out, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was that photo, and the cold, sickening truth it held. My wife, the woman I just renewed my vows to, was betraying me in the worst possible way. And I had no idea what to do next. The photo trembled in my hand. The edges crumpled where my fingers had clenched too tight. It was her, Catherine, her lips pressed against his in a way that made my stomach churn. The background was blurred, but the date stamp in the corner was clear as day, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks after our vow renewal. 2 weeks after she stood there, candlelight flickering on her face, promising me forever. I didn't knock when I walked into the bedroom. The door clicked shut behind me, the lock turning with a soft, final snick. She was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair like nothing was wrong. The scent of her perfume hung in the air, something floral and expensive, the same one I'd bought her last Christmas. It made me want to vomit. She didn't turn around, not at first, but when I dropped the photo on the vanity, the sound of it sliding across the polished wood made her freeze. Her reflection in the mirror caught mine, and for a split second, I saw it. The flicker of panic, the way her throat tightened before she smoothed her face into something neutral, calculated. "Gabriel," she started, her voice soft, almost pitying, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "You're overreacting." I didn't say anything, couldn't. My chest felt like it was caving in, and the words I'd rehearsed in my head. Who is he? How long has this been going on? Stuck in my throat like shards of glass. Instead, I just stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to say something that would make this make sense. But she didn't. She just kept brushing her hair, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was trying to buy time. Finally, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and innocent, the way they always were when she was lying. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling just enough to make it convincing. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the photo was still there, staring up at me, and the way she'd kissed him, it wasn't the kind of kiss that meant nothing. It was the kind that said, "I've done this before." The kind that said, "I'll do it again." "How long?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were shaking, and I shoved them into my pockets to hide it. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "A few months," she admitted, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "But it's over now. I swear. A few months." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A few months of her lying to my face, of her coming home to me after being with him, of her looking me in the eye and telling me she loved me. I felt like a fool. Worse than a fool. I felt like a ghost in my own life, watching her live a double one while I stood there, clueless. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to break something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But I didn't. I just stood there, silent tears streaming down my face, while she sat there, calm and composed, like she'd already moved on. "It's just a phase," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "We'll get through this. You'll see." I didn't answer. Couldn't. The locked door felt like a cage, and the silence between us was suffocating. All I could think about was the photo, the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd whispered he still has no clue at our vow renewal. And for the first time I realized I didn't know her at all. Maybe I never had. The air in the room felt heavy, like the weight of every unspoken truth was pressing down on us. I stood there, holding the photo Alex had shown me, the edges crumpled in my clenched fist. Catherine sat across from me, her legs crossed elegantly, her fingers tracing the rim of an empty wine glass. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across her face. But her expression was unreadable, cold, distant, almost amused. "Explain this?" I said, my voice low and steady, though my chest felt like it might cave in. I tossed the photo onto the coffee table. It landed with a soft thud, the image of her kissing him staring back at us, undeniable. She glanced at it, her lips curling into that faint, sarcastic smile I used to find charming. Now it felt like a knife. "Gabriel," she said, her tone light, almost dismissive. "It's just a phase. You're overreacting." A phase. The word echoed in my head, hollow and mocking. My jaw tightened as I stared at her, waiting for remorse, for guilt, for anything that might make this make sense. But her posture was rigid, defensive, her shoulders squared as if she were preparing for battle rather than a conversation about betrayal. "A phase," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You're calling this a phase? You're sneaking around with him, lying to me, and you think that's just some passing thing?" She sighed, leaning back on the couch, her fingers still idly circling the rim of the glass. "You've been so distant lately," she said, her tone shifting to one of accusation. "You're always working, always busy. What did you expect? That I'd just sit here and wait for you to notice me?" The audacity of it struck me like a slap. I felt the anger surge, hot and sharp, but I forced it down, my hands trembling at my sides. "So this is my fault?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're blaming me for this?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same icy detachment. "I'm not blaming you," she said, her voice softening, almost pitying. "I'm just saying, you haven't been there for me. Not really. Not in a long time." I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her see how twisted her logic was. But instead, I just stood there, my mind racing, trying to piece together how we'd gotten here. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as the weight of her words settled over me. "And him?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my best efforts. "Was he there for you? Is that what this is about?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the wine glass, staring at it as if it held some kind of answer. "He listens," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "He sees me. You stopped seeing me a long time ago." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of me. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that I'd always seen her, always loved her. But the truth was, I didn't know if that was enough anymore. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching out like an eternity. I sank into the chair across from her, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. The photo still lay on the table between us, a silent witness to everything we weren't saying. Catherine set the glass down, the clink of it against the table echoing in the stillness. "I'm not perfect, Gabriel," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "But neither are you. Maybe this is just what happens when two people grow apart." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw the woman I'd married. Not the cold, distant stranger sitting across from me now, but the woman who used to laugh at my jokes, who used to reach for my hand in the middle of the night. Where had she gone? And more importantly, when had I stopped noticing? "This isn't growing apart," I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "This is betrayal. And no amount of deflection is going to change that." She didn't respond. Instead, She just sat there, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of indifference. The candle on the table burned lower, the wax pooling at the base, and I realized with a sinking heart that this was it. This was the moment everything changed, and there was no going back. The clock kept ticking, each second a reminder of the time we'd lost, the trust we'd broken, and the love that had slipped through our fingers like sand. And as I sat there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever really known each other at all. The living room was dark, the kind of dark that felt like it had seeped into my bones. I sat there, motionless, the wedding ring in my hand catching what little light there was. It felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead instead of gold. My thumb traced the inscription inside, forever and always. What a joke. Forever had turned out to be about as reliable as a sandcastle in a hurricane. The clock on the wall ticked, each second louder than the last, like it was mocking me. Tick, tick, tick. I used to find that sound comforting, back when I thought time was something we had plenty of. Now it just felt like a countdown to something I couldn't name. My coffee sat on the table, untouched and cold. I'd poured it hours ago, back when I still thought I could stomach something warm. Now it just sat there, a bitter reminder of how quickly things turned cold. I reached for the wedding album on the shelf. The leather cover was smooth under my fingers, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a home where love was still alive. Opening it felt like opening a wound. There we were, younger and dumber, smiling like we had the world figured out. Her dress was white, my suit was black, and the future was this bright, shiny thing we were both too naive to question. I flipped through the pages, each one a snapshot of a life I didn't recognize anymore. The beach vacation where she'd laughed so hard she cried. The Christmas morning where we'd stayed in bed until noon, wrapped in each other and the glow of something real. The birthday party where she'd kissed me in front of everyone, her lips warm and sure against mine. But now, looking back, I could see the cracks. The way she'd started staying late at work, always with some excuse about a big project. The way her phone buzzed constantly, and how she'd always angle it away from me when she checked it. The way she'd started dressing differently, wearing things that felt more for someone else than for me. And the way she'd stopped looking at me like I was the center of her world. I chalked it up to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now, sitting here in the dark, I could see it for what it was. I'd been so busy trying to keep us afloat that I hadn't noticed she'd already jumped ship. The album slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I didn't bother picking it up. What was the point? The life in those pictures was gone, and no amount of flipping through memories was going to bring it back. The clock kept ticking, the coffee kept cooling, and I just sat there, clutching a ring that didn't mean what it used to. And then, out of nowhere, I felt it. A surge of anger so sharp it made my chest ache. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eye every day, kiss me goodnight, and still lie to me like I was nothing? I wanted to scream, to break something, to make the pain inside me match the chaos outside. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the ring in my hand, wondering how something so small could hold so much hurt. The clock kept ticking, the coffee stayed cold, and I stayed right where I was, caught between the life I thought I had and the one I was about to lose. The house felt like a tomb that night, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you swear you can hear the walls breathing. I was in the den, nursing a glass of whiskey that had long since lost its warmth, staring at the faint glow of the TV screen without really seeing it. The sound of her laughter cut through the quiet like a knife. It wasn't just laughter. It was her laughter, the kind that used to light up rooms, the kind I hadn't heard in years. Now it was directed at him, muffled through the closed door of our bedroom. I sat there, frozen, the glass trembling in my hand. The muted voices filtered through the wood, snippets of conversation that made my stomach churn. "You're ridiculous," she giggled, her voice dripping with a fondness I hadn't heard in years. "No, I'm serious. You're so much better at this than he is." My chest tightened, the whiskey souring in my mouth. I don't know why I didn't move, why I just sat there, letting her words carve deeper into me. Maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just some fleeting mistake. This was her choosing him, choosing to let him into parts of her life she'd shut me out of. The laughter continued, punctuated by little gasps and whispers that made my skin crawl. I remember the clock on the wall ticking, each second stretching into an eternity. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, the same one she used to wear when we'd go out, back when she actually wanted to be seen with me. Now it felt like a taunt, a reminder of what I'd lost. I wanted to storm in there, to throw open the door and confront her, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the dawning realization that I didn't even recognize the woman on the other side of that door anymore. When the call finally ended, I heard her sigh, the bed creaking as she shifted. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. It was the silence of someone who'd moved on, who didn't even care enough to hide it anymore. I sat there in the dark, the glass of whiskey still clutched in my hand, and for the first time, I let myself really feel it. The anger, the betrayal, the raw, aching emptiness. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep living in this house, in this marriage, like everything was fine. The contrast between her joy and my despair was too stark, too unbearable. I drained the whiskey in one burning gulp and set the glass down with a sharp clink. My decision was made. It was time to act. The day I hired the private investigator, I felt like I was stepping into a movie I never wanted to star in. His office smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner, the kind of place where secrets were traded like currency. He was a wiry guy in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had seen too many bad endings. I handed him the basics, her name, her routines, the business partner she spent so much time with. His eyes flicked over the details, and he nodded like he'd seen the story 100 times before. Maybe he had. For weeks, I lived in a strange limbo. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. Was it him? Was it her? The investigator sent updates sparingly, mostly just to let me know he was still working. I hated the waiting, but I hated the idea of not knowing even more. Meanwhile, Catherine carried on like nothing was wrong. She'd come home late, her hair smelling faintly of someone else's cologne, and I'd sit there, pretending to watch TV, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. The first real breakthrough came in a manila envelope left on my doorstep. Inside were photos, grainy but unmistakable. Catherine and him, laughing over dinner at a restaurant I didn't recognize. His hand on her leg under the table. The way she leaned into him, her body language screaming familiarity. I stared at those photos for hours, tracing the lines of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. It was the same smile she used to give me, back when we still meant something to each other. But it wasn't just the affair. The investigator dug deeper, and what he found was worse. Bank statements, credit card bills, withdrawals from our joint account that I hadn't authorized. She'd been funneling money into a separate account, one I didn't even know existed. Thousands of dollars gone. I sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out in front of me, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just her betrayal. It was the cold, calculated way she'd planned it, like I was nothing more than a stepping stone she'd outgrown. The final blow came when the investigator called me late one night. His voice was calm, almost clinical as he laid it out. "She's been meeting with a divorce lawyer," he said. "She's planning to file first, and she's got a lot of ammunition. Photos of you looking neglectful. Texts she's doctored to make it seem like you're the problem. She's setting you up to take the fall." I hung up the phone and sat there in the dark, the silence pressing in around me. My hands were shaking, but my mind was eerily clear. This wasn't just about her infidelity anymore. This was war, and for the first time in years, I felt like I knew exactly what I had to do. It was the red numbers that got me first. Stark, glaring, like a wound on the screen. The investigator had sent over the full report, and there they were, transactions, withdrawals, transfers. Hundreds of them stretching back months. Our joint account, the one we'd opened together when we bought the house, was hemorrhaging money. And not just small amounts here and there. Thousands. Tens of thousands. I scrolled through the list, my throat tightening with each new line. Spas, luxury hotels, high-end boutiques. Charges I'd never seen, never approved. Charges she'd made while I was at work or out with Alex or just not paying attention. I felt the weight of the empty wallet in my pocket. The one I'd been carrying for weeks without realizing why it always felt so light. I chalked it up to stress, to the cost of living, to anything but the truth. But now, staring at those red numbers, I couldn't ignore it anymore. She'd been bleeding us dry, and I'd been too blind to see it. The burned candle on the dining table flickered, its wax pooling around the base like tears. I'd lit it without thinking. Some habit left over from when Catherine used to insist on setting the mood for dinner. Now its scent, vanilla, her favorite, felt like a mockery. I blew it out, the smoke curling up like a ghost, and turned back to the report. The investigator had dug deeper than I'd asked. He'd found credit cards I didn't know existed, accounts in her name only, loans she'd taken out without telling me. And then there were the messages. Emails, texts, all time-stamped, all damning. She'd been planning this for months. Not just the affair, but the exit strategy. She'd been siphoning money, building a nest egg, lining up her next move. And all while I was still trying to fix us, still trying to believe we could salvage something from the wreckage. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it didn't last. It never did anymore. Instead, it gave way to something colder, heavier, a kind of weary resignation. I'd known deep down that things were bad, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd dismantled everything we'd built, piece by piece, without a second thought. I closed the laptop, the screen snapping shut with a finality that made me flinch. The room felt too quiet, too still. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in. Or maybe like it was trying to warn me. Either way, it didn't matter. The truth was out now, laid bare in those red numbers and hidden accounts. And as much as I wanted to pretend it wasn't real, I couldn't. Not anymore. I reached for the candle, still warm from the flame, and turned it over in my hands. The wax had hardened now, jagged and uneven. It felt like a metaphor for something, though I couldn't quite put it into words. Maybe it was us. Once smooth, whole, but now cracked and broken beyond repair. I set it down, my fingers brushing against the stack of papers the investigator had left. Divorce was inevitable now. I knew that, but before I could face that, I needed to see it all. Every last detail, every lie, every betrayal. I owed it to myself to know exactly what she'd done, even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. Because if there was one thing I'd learned from all of this, it was that the truth, no matter how painful, was always better than the lie. The house felt heavier that night, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of me, each one a brick in the dam I'd spent weeks building. The candle on the table had burned down to a stub, its wax pooling like a frozen tear. I'd chosen this spot deliberately, neutral ground, no bedroom intimacy, no kitchen warmth. Just cold, hard facts under the dim glow of the chandelier. Catherine walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She was still in her work clothes, that tailored blazer she loved so much draped over her shoulders. She paused when she saw me, her smile faltering for just a second before she recovered. "Gabriel, you're up late," she said, her tone light, almost playful. But her eyes flicked to the stack of papers, and I saw the flicker of unease. "Sit down," I said, my voice steady. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from me, her movements stiff, like she was bracing herself. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. I slid the first folder across the table. She glanced at it but didn't touch it. "What's this?" she asked, her voice still calm. But there was a tightness there now, a thread of tension she couldn't quite hide. "Open it," I said. She did, slowly, her manicured fingers flipping through the pages. Photos of her and him, hotel receipts, bank statements showing withdrawals from our joint account. Large sums withdrawn steadily over the past 6 months. Her face paled, the color draining like someone had pulled a plug. "Gabriel," she started, her voice wavering, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, my tone sharp. "Don't even try to spin this. I know everything. The affair, the money, the lies, all of it." She stared at me, her lips parted, her usual composure cracking. For a moment, she looked like a stranger, someone I'd never really known. Then her expression shifted, hardening into something defensive, almost defiant. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice rising. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. And for what? Some midlife crisis? Some fantasy you couldn't let go of?" Her face twisted, anger flashing in her eyes. "You think this is about him?" she snapped. This is about us, Gabriel. About how you've been checked out for years. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't feel alone every single damn day?" Her words hit me like a punch, but I didn't flinch. "So that's your excuse?" I said, my voice icy. "You feel neglected, so you destroy everything we built? You drain our savings? You lie to my face every single day." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time, she looked truly cornered, her smug facade crumbling like dry plaster. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, but she knocked it over instead, the sound of shattering glass cutting through the silence like a scream. We both stared at the shards scattered across the table, the wine pooling around the papers, staining the edges of the evidence. It felt symbolic, somehow the mess we'd made impossible to clean up. "I'm not going to fight you on this," I said finally, my voice tired but resolute. "I've got everything I need. The lawyers will handle the rest." Her face crumpled then, tears spilling over, but there was no sympathy left in me, just a hollow ache, the kind that comes when you realize you've been living a lie for far too long. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back, standing up and walking away. The sound of her sobs followed me down the hall, but I didn't look back. The dam had broken, and there was no going back. The group chat I'd been added to months ago, filled with Catherine's closest friends, lit up like a wildfire. I hadn't said a word in it since the beginning, content to let Catherine's social circle exist as a distant hum in the background of our lives. But now, it buzzed incessantly, each notification a tiny explosion of outrage. My thumb hovered over the screen as I scrolled through the messages, each one more scathing than the last. "I can't believe she did this to you, Gabe." One of them wrote, her tone dripping with righteous indignation. "We had no idea. None of us did." I didn't respond. What was there to say? They'd all been complicit in her charade, laughing at her jokes, nodding along to her stories, never questioning the cracks in the facade. But now that the truth was out, they were falling over themselves to distance themselves from her. Hypocrites, every last one of them. Catherine's chair at the dining table had been empty for weeks. I'd stopped setting a place for her after the third silent dinner, when the clink of silverware against porcelain felt like a mockery of the life we'd built together. Now the table felt cavernous, the silence oppressive. I ate alone, the food tasting like ash, my mind replaying the conversations I'd had with her friends. "She's been lying to all of us?" Another text chimed in. "We're done with her." I could picture Catherine now, sitting in the too-quiet apartment she'd moved into after I kicked her out, scrolling through her phone, watching her carefully curated world crumble. Her smug confidence had always been her armor, but now it was rusted through, brittle and useless. The group chat had been her stage, her audience, and now they'd turned on her. I didn't feel vindicated. Not really. There was a hollow satisfaction in knowing she was alone, but it was tempered by the weight of everything we'd lost. The friends who'd once filled our home with laughter and chatter were now ghosts, their absence a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered our lives. The final blow came when I ran into one of her friends at the grocery store. She hesitated when she saw me, her cart half full of organic produce and expensive wine. For a moment, I thought she might turn and leave, but instead, she approached me, her face a mask of sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Gabe," she said, her voice trembling. "We had no idea what she was capable of." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Her apology felt hollow, like a bandage on a wound that would never heal. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if Catherine had ever truly cared about any of them, or if they'd just been pawns in her endless game. The empty chair at the table stared back at me that night, a silent monument to the life we'd once shared. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the burn in my throat a welcome distraction from the ache in my chest. The group chat buzzed again, but I didn't bother to check it. Let them talk. Let them gossip. I was done with all of it. Catherine had built her life on lies, and now she was paying the price. But as I sat there, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd both lost something irreplaceable. Her friends had turned on her. Her world had collapsed, but mine felt just as empty. The only difference was, I had no one to blame but myself. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My fingers wrapped around it, the cold metal pressing into my skin as I stared at the dotted line. The room was too quiet, save for the faint hum of the lawyer's air conditioner and the occasional shuffle of papers. Catherine sat across the table, her face a mask of indifference, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped the edge of the table like she was counting down the seconds until this was over. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the past few months pressing down on me. The photos, the bank statements, the cold, calculated way she'd looked at me when I confronted her. It all flashed before me like a slideshow of betrayal, but there was no anger left, not in that moment. Just exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary kind of exhaustion that made me want to crawl into bed and sleep for a year. The lawyer cleared his throat, a subtle nudge to keep things moving. I glanced at Catherine one last time, searching for something. A flicker of regret, maybe, or even a hint of the woman I'd married. But there was nothing. Just empty eyes and a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her cheeks. I signed my name. The ink bled into the paper, dark and permanent, like a scar. When it was done, I stood up, my knees cracking from sitting too long. Catherine didn't say a word as she gathered her things, her movements sharp and deliberate. She didn't look at me, didn't offer a goodbye. Just walked out the door, her heels clicking against the tile floor until the sound faded into nothing. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty chair where she'd been sitting. The room felt too big now, the air too thin. My wedding ring was still on my finger, a habit I hadn't broken yet. I twisted it absently, the gold warm from my skin, and thought about the day I'd put it on. How sure I'd been. How naive. The lawyer handed me a copy of the papers, his face a careful blend of professionalism and pity. I took them without a word, shoving them into my briefcase like they were something shameful. Outside, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching the world wake up around me. A jogger passed by, headphones in, oblivious. A delivery truck rumbled down the street, its engine growling like a tired beast. Life went on, indifferent to my little tragedy. I got in my car and drove, not really sure where I was going. The streets were familiar, but everything felt different now. The house I'd shared with Catherine loomed in my mind, empty and cold, a monument to everything we'd lost. I didn't want to go back there, not yet, maybe not ever. Instead, I found myself at a diner I used to go to with Alex when he was a kid. The kind of place with sticky menus and coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. The waitress recognized me, her smile warm and genuine as she poured me a cup without asking. I sat in a corner booth, the divorce papers sitting heavy in my briefcase, and stared out the window. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I thought about Alex, about how he'd been the one to pull me aside that day, his face pale and his hands trembling as he showed me the photos on his phone. How he'd been the one to say, "Dad, you deserve better." He was right, of course, but it didn't make it hurt any less. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness sharp on my tongue, and let myself feel it all. The anger, the sadness, the relief. It was messy and complicated, like trying to untangle a knotted ball of string. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Like the weight on my chest had finally started to lift. I didn't know what came next. Maybe I'd sell the house. Maybe I'd take Alex on that fishing trip we'd always talked about. Maybe I'd just sit here for a while, watching the sunrise and letting myself heal. But for now I was okay. And that was enough.